It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting through my website, emailrevealer.com. You can just email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like today's shows, check out our Patreon. We're putting up 8 hours a month of brand new content, exclusive content, just the Patreon. So you could sign up there for sign up for money. You can pay money for that. But it helps support the show, helps keep us on the air. But our archives are always free. Go to Spreaker.com, you sign up there for free. And there's a chat room, and you get an email notification anytime we put up new content there on the archives. And we've done many, many shows on JFK assassination. So you could just put in Opperman, Spreaker, JFK, a ton of shows will come up. Today we have a very distinguished guest that has a great reputation, well known in his field as an expert, an authority on this topic. His name is Gary Hill. He's written a book that just came out called The Other Oswald. Okay, I had to pull it up a second ago. Where is this? The Other Oswald. A Wilderness of Mirrors. The story of Lee Harvey Oswald and Robert E. Webster. You can check him out on his website, theotheroswald.com. Mr. Hill, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, thank you so much. I just contacted
Glad to be here, Ed, very much.
No, thank you, because at last minute, I just contacted you yesterday, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Tell us about yourself. Who is Gary Hill?
I'm a retired teacher. I taught for 33 years, and I became interested in the JFK assassination when it happened. I was 15 years old. Or 16. No, maybe I was 17. I was 17 years old when it happened, and even at that age, I'd lived through the 50s, which was, like Leave It to Beaver, and everybody believed in the country and everything that happened. And even at that age, I thought it funny that a left-wing liberal would kill a left-wing liberal president with no motive, and I just couldn't figure out what his motive was. And then when he was killed by Jack Ruby, I really thought that something's amiss here, and we don't know the whole story. So I thought that the Warren Commission would solve the problem, but they didn't. And I thought, well, maybe they didn't have the right info. So I started to dig and read everything I could find, and there wasn't much in those days. It's only with the recent release of documents that we've had that pieces of the puzzle are finally starting to come together, and there's still many missing. If this guy was a lone nut, why, after 55 or 60 years, are we still hiding the information? So I continued to research it on and off all my life. And I got interested in reading when some of the early journals, like the Fourth Decade, came out. I wrote a couple articles for them. And then I started to get documents through the Freedom of Information Act. And I went to Dallas, and I talked to some people. And it just progressed over the years. And every time new documents would come out, I'd get more information. So I came to the point where, I'm getting old, and I need to put this stuff down on paper for the next generation, for people who are researchers that can go from where I left off. And what really hit me, got me going, was I was at my cousin's house, and an ex-teacher of mine was there, and we were talking about the JFK assassination. And he said to me, well, there was another Oswald in Zelienople, Pennsylvania. I said, what? And then he mentioned the name Robert Webster. And as soon as he mentioned Robert Webster, I knew who Robert Webster was. But what I didn't know was that he was from Zelienople. And Zelienople is only about 35 or 40 minutes from me. So I decided to really dig it. I could, find out something. So I went to Zelienople, and I talked to some people, and I went to the library to find his yearbook, and there were about 40 yearbooks there, except the year that he graduated.
Wow.
That book was missing. And so I went to the Historical Society, and that one was missing.
Wow.
So I finally found a classmate of his that gave me a copy of his yearbook, and that started the whole thing. Then I started writing articles. Well, I kindly forgot about it until recently, and then I decided, I had tried to find Webster a few times, and finally I was in contact with Carol Hewitt, who's a very famous researcher in the area. She's a lawyer. I forget where she lives, but we started communicating by email, and she found out through Mary Farrell that Webster was in a nursing home in Massachusetts. So she volunteered to, she said her and a friend of hers were going on a trip up that way, and they would stop at the nursing home and try to interview Webster. Well, they did, and it turned out that Webster had a stroke, and he was basically not able to communicate much, so they didn't get anything out of it. And then I talked to Dick Russell, the journalist, and he was interested in it, so he went to see him. And the only thing he got out of him was he asked him if he knew Marina Oswald. Now, Marina has said that she never knew Webster, but we can get into that later. It's pretty obvious that she must have known him. And he said yes. He nodded his head yes. And Webster passed away in 1999. Oh, so when I got...
Wait, let me stop you for a second here, because I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because, hey, who is Robert E. Webster, and why is he important?
Okay.
Why were you even talking about him?
That's a good question. Yeah. That's right. I just assumed that everybody knew who he was. Robert Webster was a defector that defected to Russia 2 weeks before Lee Harvey Oswald. And he also had, like when Oswald had a Russian wife and child, Webster she wasn't his wife because he was married back home, but he had a concubine, a wife, common law wife, and a child, same as Oswald. He came back 2 weeks before Oswald.
Wow.
So right away, there's a lot of things that they had in common. Well, then I discovered that in Marina Oswald's notebook is listed Webster's address in Kiev, his apartment building. And she had the name Lev Brzezinski for that address. Well, the Warren Commission interviewed her about it, and she said, no, it wasn't Webster. It was this guy who was in love with a girlfriend of hers who was married, and she was going to intervene in between. But then when they went to look for this Lev Brzezinski, there was no such person. So, I mean, that's interesting in itself when you consider that Marina Oswald was about 19 years old, and here she's met two defectors from the United States, and one in Kiev and one in Minsk. So, the odds against, with the travel restrictions and a girl of her age to meet those two defectors, there's something going on. And I believe that the Russians had some kind of program to tie these girls to these defectors and then send them home.
Okay, well, Gary, let me ask you this. How common was, because I always said this, man, because people say, well, everyone flees communist countries to come to America. No one ever is going over there. And I would always say, well, one guy did, Lee Harvey Oswald, and if he's the only guy, why wouldn't they have Secret Service standing right next to him down there in Dealey Plaza, right? If he's the only guy that went to Russia and came back, how common was this? Are these the only two guys, or were there more?
No. In the 10 years before 1960, there were two defectors to Soviet Union or countries, related to the Soviet Union. By 1960, there were 7 in 1 year, and 6 of them came back. Now, what was happening, well, my research shows, and what a lot of researchers do also believe, was the Office of Naval Intelligence was running a false defector program during that period of the Cold War. They were trying to send over dangles that the Soviets would pick up, and then they could double them, and we'd have information. But the CIA was involved in this program as well, and they were involved with the ONI. And I have come to the conclusion that Oswald was part of this false defector program, and he was sent over there. And he was, in fact, part of a mole hunt that James Angleton was running. He was obsessed that there was a mole in the U2 program. And so Oswald was actually his singleton agent, meaning that he handled him alone without the rest of the CIA necessarily knowing that he was working for them. And he used him as a dangle. Well, Webster was a real defector. He fell in love with a girl over there, and he was going to defect. But Webster became an opportunity for Angleton to have a double dangle. The two men would be confused. They gave him a lot of the same information, and that was to confuse the Soviets. But Webster was working, at the time he went over there, he was working for Rand Development Corporation. And Rand Development Corporation is a CIA conglomerate. They have CIA contracts, and they work with the Air Force intelligence, and they were involved in a lot of projects over there. So somehow Rand was using Webster. I don't think they encouraged him necessarily to defect, but once he did, they used him as a dangle, and they used him in this intelligence program.
Now, the women that they were meeting over there, were these KGB women? What was going on with that?
Well, this woman that Webster met worked at this hotel, the Metropole, I think it was, hotel, at the time that Nixon was over there for the kitchen debates. And the CIA kind of suspected that she might be a KGB agent, but that was never proved. She was separated from her husband, and her and Webster supposedly fell in love. And when he was involved in plastics with Rand, and the Soviets were behind in plastics as well as the U-2 plane. So he was very much of interest to them because he could give them information that they needed in the field of plastics, and he thought that he would become an entrepreneur over there in that area, and then he'd marry Vera and live happily ever after. But it didn't work out that way. He got homesick, and his mother had a nervous breakdown, and so he decided to abandon her and her child and come back to the U.S. He had abandoned his children and his wife in the United States to go to Russia. Now he abandoned them to come back. So what's interesting, though, is he remarried in the late 60s, and I managed to get in touch with his two sons that he had by the second marriage, and they were a huge help in the book. His son Scott sent me all the pictures that are in the book, documents, Russian documents, and was a huge help to have that kind of... I'm hearing music.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I fix it.
Okay. If I'm going too fast, stop me, slow me down, or
no, you're fine.
Pin me down.
You're fine.
Pin me down on something. Another interesting thing about Webster and Oswald was that when Marina came back to the United States with Oswald, and they settled with the white Russian community in Dallas, she told a friend of hers, a woman named Katya Ford, that she met her husband at the Moscow Trade Exhibition. And that was not Oswald. That Webster was at the exhibition.
Oh, fast. Oh, that's right, because he was there with the Rand, right. Okay.
Yeah, he worked for Rand, and they were doing an exhibition there. He was there 3 times, and it was the 3rd time he defected. He didn't come back. That's when he had met Vera the 2nd time. But I think he met Marina in that period, and Marina probably tried to... I think the Russians had the program I told you. They were sending women back, and they became sleeper agents here. And so they were possibly trying to get Marina to take one of these defectors and come home with them. And she was, her uncle was an MVD, which is like FBI here, and so he would have been involved in that program. But I think Marina just came here and liked it so much she decided, I'm not going back to Russia. I like it here. But to tell someone that to forget how you met your own husband and get him confused with Webster is another. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking. And didn't Marina too have like a landlady or something like that that had suspicious background as well?
A landlady.
No?
Marina?
Okay. Yeah, Marina, yeah. No. Okay.
No, I don't think so.
Now, then what is...
you may be thinking of Ruth Payne.
Yeah, okay, what was Ruth Payne? Remind me.
Oh, my God, Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne is a woman who was introduced to the Oswalds by George de Mohrenschildt. And I don't know how much your people know about George de Mohrenschildt, but he was CIA, and he was Oswald's babysitter in Dallas. And he apparently turned him over to Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne was supposedly wanting to learn Russian, and she befriended Marina and then offered to have Marina live at her house while Oswald went off finding jobs or whatever. And she had a lot to do with breaking them up and separating them. And Ruth Payne's house is the house that Marina was living in at the time of the assassination in Irving, Texas. And what Oswald did was the night before the assassination, the Warren Commission story is that he went home with a friend. He went to Ruth Payne's house the night before the assassination to get his gun, which was stored in Ruth's garage. And so then he, supposedly assassinated the president. Well, when they went to Ruth Payne's house, this is where they found all the evidence against Oswald in her house. She was the one that really made him the guilty person, And then but if you dig into Ruth Payne's life, she's got so many ties to the CIA that it's unbelievable. Her father worked for the CIA. Her sister worked for the CIA. Her sister-in-law, her brother-in-law worked for the CIA. And Ruth was involved in all this stuff. And her, like Webster, were Quakers, which is really unique. And I have in my book some information from a researcher that did a lot of work on CIA-used religious groups like the Unitarians and the Quakers.
Right.
They used their churches as fronts and money laundering and so forth, and there's ties to all that. But Ruth Payne was not her landlady, but she let her live at her house. And
wasn't Ruth Payne the one that got Oswald the job over at the Texas School?
Yes,
I see that?
She got him the job at the Texas School Book Depository. And what's really interesting is that the day after she got him had him go apply for that job, he got another call from the unemployment office for a job that paid more money and was permanent, and she never told him.
Wow.
This was a temporary job and at minimal pay.
Now, what's the story now? Oswald and Webster, are they stumble bums, just stumbling around here, people just goofing around, or were they some type of agents as well?
Well, Oswald was definitely tied to the CIA, and also later on he was an informant for the FBI. And I think that what was going on in Cuba after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy promised that we would not invade Cuba. He promised Khrushchev that to make the deal to get the missiles out. But what was happening was the CIA continued to train Cuban exiles and send them on raids to try to provoke a war with another invasion of Cuba. Well, Kennedy was being embarrassed by this, and he told Bobby Kennedy to put the FBI on the CIA's tail to stop these camps and things that they were training exiles in and stop these raids. So the FBI was infiltrating these, and I think that Oswald was an infiltrator, infiltrating these right-wing Cuban in New Orleans. He was Lake Pontchartrain, they were training him. He was infiltrating Guy Bannister's office, and he was reporting back to the FBI for Bobby Kennedy. And I think Bobby Kennedy may have recognized his name after the assassination and knew that he was a patsy and knew that, what had happen. But yes, he was an agent. Now, as far as Webster goes, although he was not CIA or agent or anything, I found documents from Air Force intelligence about a program named Longstride, a project called Longstride. And this project had Webster's name on it. Webster was involved in Project Longstride, and he had a code name which was Guide 223. And one of his fellow workers was named Lincoln Leeds. They had code names, and they were working with the Air Force somehow on some kind of project. And here's the kicker. This Air Force, the Department of the Air Force that was running Longstride, Ruth Payne's sister worked for them. Sylvia Hyde-Hoke worked for that division of the Air Force that was running Webster's program. And it was personnel. And she also was working for the CIA from 61, I think, on. So there's so many ties, strings, if you will, that go from this person to that person that can't be all coincidence.
No, definitely not. Now, when people read the title of your book, right?
Yeah.
The Other Oswald, right?
Mm-hmm.
And before you get to the story of Lee Harvey Oswald, Robert E. Webster, Wilderness of Mercy, I think a lot of people will first assume, well, he's talking about all those doubles that were running around, and all those those lookalikes. But you do write about the lookalikes a bit, right?
Yeah, but no, that's not really what it's meant. The Other Oswald came from the statement my teacher made that got this all started. He said, there was another Oswald in Leonople. That's where the title came from. And actually, he wasn't a double, but they were constantly mixed up together. What the CIA did, they had this false defector program, and they had this dangle program where they actually they gave them the same 5'10", 160 pounds, same descriptions, so that they would be confused by the Russians. Well, they were also confused here. And here's what's interesting. I found some documents. There was the day of the assassination, or the day after the assassination, an anonymous person called the FBI in Cleveland and told them that Lee Harvey Oswald was living in a hotel with a prostitute. Her name was Nancy Jane McLean, and that they had been living there, and that Oswald was planning to rob some businesses or stuff, and then they were going to make a trip to Dallas or something, and that she also knew Jack Ruby and all this. So the FBI honed in on this, and Oswald was never in Cleveland. But Robert Webster had been working for Rand in Cleveland, and at the time of the assassination, he was living in Wellsville, Ohio. So they immediately went to Wellsville and found his boss and said, was he at work? They were worried that him and Oswald somehow in cahoots in the assassination. And this was right the day after, So they're looking at Webster, and his boss said, no, he was at work that day. He wasn't involved in all this stuff. But they had confused him. The FBI had confused the two of them. And then another anonymous source said that Lee Harvey Oswald was living in Zelienople, and he left his wife and kids to go to Russia. And they checked in Zelienople. No, that wasn't Oswald. That was Webster. So they were constantly being confused with each other. And that, in a sense, makes him a double. The reason that he's not the other Oswald, to me, is that their stories are so similar. Two ex-Navy men that defect at the same time, come back at the same time. And there's more in it. I mean, we can go deeper and deeper. I hate to get involved in the CIA Project MK Ultra, because I have found documents now that Rand Corporation was involved in Subproject 79 of MK Ultra, which was the CIA's mind control program, and they were using drugs and hypnosis to create Manchurian candidates, or at least, manipulate people into and their behavior. And so if Rand was involved in that project, and Oswald worked at Atsugi in Japan, which was a CIA base, and it was a base for MK Ultra as well. So you can dig in and as much as you want.
One of the goals of MK Ultra was to create assassins, so it's not far-fetched at all.
Yeah, assassins and patsies.
Yeah, right. Is it possible?
Yeah, actually.
We're about to take a commercial break, but is it possible that Webster was running around using Oswald's name sometimes?
I think that is a possibility, and that could explain the Cleveland episode with this Nancy Jane McLean. He was between marriages. He liked ladies, and he could have been involved with a prostitute, and they just assumed it was Oswald because he had been to Russia and maybe he was using Oswald's name so people wouldn't know he was involved with a prostitute. That's very possible.
Okay, this is all fascinating stuff, and it's a lot of stuff I've never heard before, and I like to consider it. You know what I mean? We have with us today Gary Hill, who's the author of the book, The Other Oswald, A Wilderness of Mirrors, the story of Lee Harvey Oswald and Robert E. Webster. You can find that at theotheroswald.com. Another book he's written about is called The House on Harlandale. Now, Mr. Hill, JFK researcher community is probably the toughest audience in the world. How has your book been received? Because it's just out.
I think it's been, you're right. It's the toughest audience in the world, and researchers are brutal. If you say one thing without documentation, they're all over you or so forth. But the response to my book has been very good, and I was lucky enough to have Bill Simpich write the preface for the book, and he's a very highly respected researcher. He's a lawyer civil rights lawyer out in California, and he's head of the Mary Farrell website. And I also had Dr. Walt Brown, Ph.D. in history, and a JFK expert do the foreword. And that really helped to, pave the way when researchers see their names. Mm-hmm. They say, wait, this book must have something in it, to read. And so far, it's 5 stars on Amazon. Everybody seems to, to think it's a worthwhile read, and it is probably the go-to book on Webster. Not all that much has been written about Robert Webster in the past, so it's an area for researchers to build on and use to go to the next step, I guess.
Now, how was Oswald's cousin tied to Oswald's defection?
You mean Lillian Moret?
Yeah, Marilyn Moret.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Lillian Moret is a very strange person. Oswald's mother's sister was married to a guy named Dutz Moretz, who was actually a bookmaker in the Carlos Marcello organized crime organization. He was a foot soldier. He was not a mobster, but he worked and he knew those people. And his daughter Marilyn was a teacher, and she traveled all over the world with no assets, no money. And she seems to have had ties to the CIA. Let me look here. Listen to this. I have it here. She attended Loyola University, LSU, Duke, the University of California, the Sorbonne in France, University of Madrid, St. Louis University, and Tulane to get a bachelor's degree.
Wow.
Then she traveled all over the world constantly to teach, supposedly. She traveled to New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Japan, the Holy Land, Egypt, Beirut, Karachi, and Pakistan, and all these countries to teach. And who was paying for all this? But it turns out that she was being investigated when she went to Russia. She was being investigated as a possible communist not I can't think of the word. She was somehow involved with this communist apparatus of a guy named Professor Harold Isaacs of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and so they were exploring her and looking at her as someone of interest to the FBI or the CIA at the time because of her travels. So it may well have been that she played some role in getting Oswald connected through CIA people when he went to Russia. But we don't know.
I've never heard any mention of her prior to this.
Yes, she's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And what about his brother? His brother's alive today. Anything with his brother?
No, his brother just died.
Oh, really? Okay.
Not too long ago. Robert, his brother Robert died about... No, he was in... Robert was a Marine, and he is... Unfortunately, he's a guy who condemns his brother as guilty. And as a friend of the Warren Commission said, yeah, he did it. I believe he did it. And he really took the other side against his brother. And he had a stepbrother named John Pick, who was older yet, and I'm not sure if he's alive. He was in the Merchant Marines. And what's interesting is when Oswald defected to Russia, Marilyn Moret visited John Pick in Japan. Japan. And she told him, did you know Lee is going to Russia or is in Russia or is in Eastern Europe now? And John Pick said no. And then afterwards, he got to thinking about it, and no one knew that he was in. It didn't come out in the Stars and Stripes till like the next week that he had defected. So she knew it before the newspaper had it, which is somehow strange and somehow bizarre.
Another interesting tidbit. Now, you also touch upon Jack Ruby's role in the Tibbet shooting. What do you have there?
Well, what I found was the Tibbet shooting is bizarre because it was, number one, it was never investigated because once Oswald was dead, they didn't care. They just blamed it on him. And number two, the witnesses all had different stories as to who they saw and what happened. But what I did find was interesting was that Jack Ruby had connections to almost all of the witnesses of the Tippit assassination. Somehow, one of the guys that was a witness used to own a bar called Hernando's Hideaway, and he sold it to Jack Ruby. And then he became a bouncer for Jack Ruby in Jack Ruby's club. Helen Markham, the Warren Commission's main witness, who testified, that she saw Oswald do the shooting. Ruby had gone that night while she was at the police station looking through lineups. She worked at a restaurant called the Eat Well Restaurant in downtown Dallas. And the evening of the assassination, Jack Ruby went into the Eat Well. He ate there all the time. He went in there looking for her and asked about her. And they said, well, she's sick. She's not here today, but she was at the police station. And then the two women at the house in front of the Tippit shooting, there was a house, the Davis sisters, who identified Oswald in a lineup. Their phone numbers showed up in Jack Ruby's at Jack Ruby's bar. What happened was he had a guy answering the phone. Larry Crawford was answering the phone for Jack Ruby when Jack Ruby wasn't there, and he wrote down the phone numbers of the Davis sisters. So why were they trying to contact Jack Ruby? And then I found that one of his strippers lived in the same apartment as Helen Markham, and also lived in the same place, I think, the Davis sisters, on the street where Tippett was shot. She had lived there at one time. And there's just connection after connection. Somehow they're all tied into Jack Ruby.
You know, I tell you, one thing that's always struck me, and I always forget his name, but when you see when Oswald gets shot by Ruby, the cop in the white tan, the only white tan outfit in the whole crowd, this guy,
LaBelle.
Mr.
James.
Don't shoot me by mistake, LaBelle, is holding Oswald up and doesn't flinch at all when the shooting starts. If you just watch that scene, just watching him, he don't flinch at all, man. Yeah.
That's James LaBelle, and he has talked about that. He's been interviewed many times, and he said that he had his hand inside Oswald's belt so that he could control him if something happened. And he didn't do anything when it happened. And strangely, I like little trivial things that pop up that people say and do. On the way down in the elevator to the garage, LaBelle said to Oswald, he said, if somebody tries to shoot you, I hope they're I hope they're as good a shot as you are. And Oswald said, nobody's going to do that. I find that I like that. It's ironic.
That is a good line. Now you wrote a whole book about the house on Harlandale Street, but what was the role of John Thomas Mason and the house on Harlandale Street? Tell us about that house.
Yeah, well, what was happening in '63 was that this Cuban exile group, primarily Alpha 66, which was the most violent of all the Cuban exile groups that wanted to kill Castro and wanted an invasion of Cuba, were meeting there. And not only were they meeting there, there were elements of CIA. There were elements of there was involvement with the Cuban, with the Dallas oil men, right-wing fanatics, John Birchers, and it all kind of seemed to come together in that house. And it seems apparent that there was a planned second invasion of Cuba going on. At the end of November or beginning of December, they were planning an invasion of Cuba, and they were stealing arms from a military base. They had a guy, an ordnance officer, that was smuggling them guns, and the FBI was closing their eye to it. They let it happen. And so Hoover was involved in that too. So what was going on was this, and there was a guy named John Thomas Mason who was involved with these Cubans, and he was a right-wing Minuteman, Bircher type guy, and a gun nut who sold arms. And he was a double for Oswald. He looked just like him. And he was involved with these Cubans, and he was getting them weapons. And he was being investigated by the alcohol, tobacco, firearms agent named Frank Ellsworth was investigating him. And at the time of the assassination, and all of a sudden, the FBI dried that up and stopped it right after the assassination. So this Mason was involved in the gun running. Jack Ruby was involved in gun running to Cuba. And these guys were all together probably at this house on Harlandale, and supposedly Oswald was seen going there, although it could have been Mason because they look alike. And when Oswald left the school book depository after the assassination and went back to his apartment, and then supposedly was walking and shot Tippett on his way. He was headed in the direction of two things, one or the other. He was headed toward Jack Ruby's apartment, or he was headed toward Harlandale to maybe get out of the country or whatever, you know. So the house in Harlandale to me is crucial. We just don't have enough yet documents to support it, but some of the most violent Cubans were there, and they were meeting, and they were running guns and planning an invasion of Cuba. And part of it, part of the invasion of Cuba was to kill Castro. But then I think what they did was they turned that around on Kennedy. The CIA mafia plots are the key to the whole thing. They were trying to kill Castro using the mafia, the CIA was. And a group within that project, it was Bill Harvey that was running that project for the CIA, and he became best friends with Johnny Roselli of the mafia. And so they were working together, and also with some of the Miami Wave CIA station people like Morales and those guys. And that's the group, I think. They just turned the operation around
right.
to kill Kennedy instead. And that Harlandale may have been part of that.
What do you, your research, what do you make of Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt and those guys?
Definitely, they were involved.
Okay.
Howard Hunt was the money man, a bag man. He wasn't involved directly. But have you ever had Hunt's son on your show?
Yeah, I'm good friends with St. John Hunt, with his Sturgis's nephew, Jim Hunt. You know, coincidentally, Doug Caddy.
Yeah,
become good friends with Doug Caddy. Yeah.
So Hunt has, his father basically, laid it on the line, except that he said he was on the second team and he wasn't involved. But Howard Hunt was thickly involved in Cuba, and that's where that group, came from. So, and Sturgis wasn't, involved, according to Marina. What's her name? Lorenz.
Marita Lorenz.
Marita Lorenz. Yeah. She went with Sturgis to Dallas, and he was there, and they were there. They were, they were involved in some way, not shooters or anything, but working the team, I guess.
Yeah, unfortunately, Marita Lorenz just died as well.
Yes.
Thank God for the Freedom of Information Act, Jimmy Carter, because we would have none of this information,
And also, thanks to what really made a difference too was the movie JFK.
That's true. Yeah.
Because it got the AARB appointed, and it got a younger generation interested in the subject. And so now that ARB has released more documents than, we would have ever had, and I wouldn't have. I mean, that last batch is where I got a lot of the stuff that's in my book through those documents. They're just stuff in there that sneaks through every little bit. I mean, there's no big smoking gun, but there's now this comes out. This is, the relationships between people.
We're running really short on time. I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned the Corsican assassins. And that seemed, what did you come up with that? Because that's been thrown around a lot, too. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a long story. What got me really interested in that was I found a document that Mary Farrell uncovered, that this is like the day after the assassination, the INS, or the FBI, deported this guy from Dallas, and he was a French assassin, and his name was Jean Suetre, and Suetre had tried to assassinate de Gaulle, and he is the theme for the movie, what was that movie that was made?
Day of the Jackal?
Day of the Jackal. He's the figure for that.
Great movie.
So I started wondering, why did they quietly deport an assassin, a right-wing assassin, from Dallas without telling the Warren Commission or anybody about it? And the reason we found out was the French wrote to the government, to the INS, and said, Charles de Gaulle is going to Mexico in 2 weeks, and we're worried about where John Suetre is, because you deported him. Did you deport him to Mexico, or did you deport him to Canada? We want to know. And so that document got through, and the censors didn't catch it. So I looked into this John Suetre, and he's a member of the French OAS, which were the people that tried to assassinate de Gaulle. They were mad about giving Algeria its freedom, which John Kennedy was involved in convincing de Gaulle to do. They hated Kennedy, too. And they were I discovered that they were not only involved in the the heroin network through Marcello and Trafficante through to Corsica, but they were also involved with the mafia as assassins. They were hired as assassins. And it turns out that there was another guy named John Mertz. And Mertz used Suetra's name, and Suetra used Mertz's name, and he was an assassin and a killer. So I finally determined that I think Mertz was the one in Dallas that was behind the knoll and killed Kennedy. And then he was using the name Suetra, who was his rival in the OAS, and they quietly snuck him out of Dallas, the FBI, because he was also connected to SDECE, STEC, which is French intelligence. And so he was called an untouchable in France because he had saved de Gaulle's life. And so they couldn't touch him. He's untouchable. So
gotcha. But Gary,
they deported him.
Yeah, we're totally out of time. I got to have you come back, man, okay?
Sure.
Please do, man. Gary Hill is the author. The book we've been talking about is The Other Oswald, A Wilderness of Mirrors, the story of Lee Harvey Oswald and Robert E. Webster. I've interviewed a lot of people firsthand involved in this thing. Gary Hill really knows what he's talking about. Gary Hill, man, thank you so much. Okay, you have an open door. Anytime you want to come back,
Thank
I'll put
you
you right
so
in.
much.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ed.